Thanks for the invitation. I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today, and Wurundjeri elders past and present and emerging. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues whose work I'll be sharing today. Most of what I'm sharing with you today I did not directly work on, but it is really good. Well, no, and those things may well correlate. But I hope to convince you of maybe you don't need convincing, but sort of share three perspectives. I'm not going to answer this question. I'll leave that for you to answer, but I'm going to share, I hope to convince you, I guess, that design-based processes have something to contribute in developing evidence-informed solutions and practice. I want to explore that maybe evidence isn't enough alone to get us to the future, and we kind of need to think a little bit more systemically about where we want to get to, but also to share some perspectives on what a future social services, or social system, what our future social ecosystem might look like, and some components of that. Be really interested to know about the things that I've missed in that. So it's very much only coming from our perspective at the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. Good, it works. Thanks for Sam for fixing my slides, by the way. That was an epic journey. And so a few years back, 3 years ago, we were in conversation with the director then of FACS, Family and Community Services in New South Wales, and she raised the idea, well, what if foster care was actually about reconnect, not only just for kids, but actually for birth parents, and sort of supported the development of birth parents and of children and young people. And we thought that was a pretty interesting idea. We made a proposal to the Sydney Myer Fund, and they graciously granted us 3 years of funding to explore that, that very question. We started that project with a literature review supported by our colleagues at the Australian Centre for Child Protection, and the conclusion of that, so is looking into sort of what works in the restoration space and for whom, and what are the kind of practices if we're developing a new program, or even looking at adopting an existing program, what would we take forward? And the evidence was somewhat inconclusive. The nature of the studies meant that we couldn't port ideas from one space to another, and the studies were so different in their nature that it was hard to compare across those. So what do you do? So we began to think about how could we find some evidence of what works when it comes to restoration. And often in our work, we look for the bright spots, or a term that I really like is this idea of positive deviance. Where is the positive deviance in the system? Where are things happening surprisingly well? And through talking to people and meeting lots and lots of people over a number of months, we began to find practitioners, government practitioners that were doing really well in the restoration space, particular services that were doing particularly well, also carers, foster carers, who were doing really interesting stuff, and families that had experienced good, effective, lasting restorations. And so we began to try and understand what is it that, that makes these restorations work, and how can we kind of bring together that practice wisdom, that lived experience wisdom, with what the literature was telling us, and start to spot patterns across those things. In New South Wales, the rate of successful restorations is something like this, 25%. And then we met Jackie. And Jackie ran a team in Parramatta, and this is Jackie's stats, the stats of her team. She has an 85% success rate. This is sort of self-reported, it's not evaluated, in restorations. And she was running a sort of a team over a number of years, and that sort of team actually got sort of somewhat disbanded. The central office at FACS wasn't aware of these statistics, but this looks like some really interesting practice that we should be learning from. And so we began to understand from Jackie what is it that was enabling that. We also discovered that actually it's one of the things we do at TACS is we incubate new kinds of social programs. Family by Family is one of those. And we discovered that we had a practitioner in New South Wales, a family coach who supports families to help families, who is also really good at supporting restorations. And it was in her own program. We didn't know about it. So we talked to her to try and understand what she was doing, and began to bringing together those three lenses of lived experience of the literature and evidence base and the practice wisdom, understand what are the success factors for restorations. We met lots of families that had experienced perhaps one or two of these, but where families had more of these factors, it seemed that restorations were more successful and seemed to be lasting from what we could tell. So through that process, that funding was, as I said, lasted for 3 years. The first year was really about trying to understand the current situation. The second year about developing a new approach and a new model. And then the third year, the current year that we're just finishing up, is about trialing that. And we got to develop 3 different models in the sort of 6 months of work that in that second year. One was casework practice, so spreading and replicating and developing a way to replicate that practice that Jackie's team was so effectively putting into practice. Co-parenthood, we'll talk a little bit more about, a shared parenting approach to foster care, and joined up, which I'll also talk a little bit more about. But all of these were informed at the outset in that discovery stage by bringing together these 3 different lenses, but also in an ongoing way. So we've continuously built a team around these projects to bring together that lived experience, practice wisdom, and the literature and evidence base, even as the program itself was evolving. So so we involved these things throughout. So to talk about some of the underlying principles of our approach. So the first is that our approach is about testing assumptions, and typically that means developing things in the office in places like this and then getting out in the real world and testing them. And the more times you do that loop, the more likely your assumptions are to match the reality. So this can be assumptions about who might use it. It can be assumptions about sort of what creates change, but all the time, and it's really from that starting point that everything we're working with is assumptions, even if there's different degrees of evidence behind those assumptions. Taking a design approach, so often design here coming informed by participatory design traditions and informed by user-centered design traditions and human-centered design traditions, mostly coming from a commercial space. So there's real focus on desirability, because that's important, because if people don't want to use stuff or don't want to engage with stuff, they're not going to want to be part of it. So how do you, and that was the real value that working with families brought, is helping us shape a program and parts of a program that people would actually want to be part of and see value in. Desirability, viability, so can this actually work, and the feasibility, do the numbers stack up at this? So also looking at, so currently looking at a theory of change, looking at the customer experience, and looking at the business model behind any given program. We think about moving through innovation as a journey. So you start with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questions, and over time a good innovation process will efficiently and effectively help you reduce that uncertainty. In the first year was discovery, the second year design, the third year trial. Discovery is really what's the opportunity here, that's the question you're trying to answer. The design stage, what's the solution? And trial stage is trying to develop some evidence of how to work, does it work, and also to how can we refine that model. One of the methods that we use a lot is prototyping. So in piloting, typically, not always, but typically you'll have a sort of 6 or 12-month periods. The program's somewhat designed before you start. You've got one loop of learning from that evaluation, unless, of course, you've got some really good developmental evaluation going along the way. Prototyping, those learning cycles are a lot looser and freer and quicker. So it might be, for example, with the Family by Family program, we changed the recruitment materials 5 times in 2 days. We went through 3 versions of training in 2 weeks, all the time trying to learn what might create outcomes rather than proving that something that create outcomes. So it's piloting we use as a pre-pilot method to rapidly develop new programs and services, or policies for that matter. And the point is to mitigate risk, because it's cheaper and critically, I think, in a government setting, less embarrassing to make mistakes early on and at a smaller scale, or to learn early on or at a smaller scale, rather than when you've invested in rolling things out across the state. There are 17 17 of them, and you've got to recall them, or they don't work, or you've got to change them all at once. So it's about getting good value for public investment, which is often a narrative that works well with sort of senior government folks. And a really important partner to acknowledge in this work has been MacKillop Family Services. So we sort of half designed the model with families, and then once we know what we want, what we needed, and the kind of capabilities we needed in the kind of more practice wisdom we need in the kind of provider we needed, we interviewed a whole bunch of service providers to find who would be a best values fit with this particular program, and ended up working with MacKillop Family Services to do that, and drawing on their great experience with the sanctuary model. And so this is what co-design looked like. It looked like at the early stages testing conceptual models. So we're always trying to find how can you make things tangible and testable. Here's some parents looking at the sequencing of activities. You can see it's pretty rough and ready, but like, what would the service experience be like? And all the time we're using these quite rough and ready ways of developing things and backing them up with more concrete ways. So this is a service blueprint. This talks about the user experience at different stages and the different tools and touch points that you'd need at each of these stages. So that's sort of the blueprint effectively for the model. Some more prototyping and testing here, more with the service providers, and prototyping, iteratively developing our theory of change alongside that service blueprint, and ultimately reaching a model that is now sort of packaged up and ready for replication. So here's some of the folks at one of the first trainings for co-parenthood. And in terms of the model itself, well, it's some new kinds of roles. It's an idea about what a restoration journey needs to involve, and some sort of checklists to help people through that. But also some tools that have been through a number of iterations with carers and with families and with providers, that new family link role, to help put in place the conditions and learning experiences that make restoration more likely. So this is a little restoration readiness tool. This is a chatter book. But lots of attention on some of the what can seem quite small details, but that ensure that folks stay engaged throughout this process. Now we're going on to continuing our work with MacKillop, but also working with Marin Wijali Aboriginal Corporation to build a version of this that's designed with and for Aboriginal communities. So working with Aboriginal practice wisdom, working with Aboriginal birth parents, working with Aboriginal carers to really shape this experience to work in that community. And beyond that, we're really interested in how we can take this, spread this model, but it's not quite refined enough yet for some of those more formal evaluation approaches. We are currently running a developmental evaluation around it with MacKillop. But we're really interested in finding providers that are interested to help us develop the model in a collaborative way. So how can we, this model's say 3/4 designed, how can we work with a number of different providers to refine this model, learn from each other, and collectively innovate, collectively learn about what it takes to make good restorations and what kinds of models can support that. So those are the next couple of steps on our journey, and if you're interested in it, the URLs are up there at the moment. We're seeking providers that might be interested in doing just that and involved in some collaborative innovation. So just thinking about another program, I mentioned Family by Family a few times, and that's a program that we went through a similar process with. That was over a year, and we spent time with, we started with the question, how can we enable more families to thrive and for you to come into contact with child protection services? We spent time with families trying to learn not about that question, but about what makes great family and what's helpful help for families. Spotting positive deviance, so we found a mum that was living in domestic violence rehousing who was really helping others in her community, typically over a beer at 8 o'clock in the garden and providing really good informal support. An Aboriginal dad in Port Augusta who was deliberately going out of his way to take families out bush on the weekend to have a barbecue and to have a bit of fun, but also to provide some informal supports. And we thought, how can we replicate more of these? And when we spoke to families about what's helpful help, they said it's more likely to come from somebody who's a bit like me, who's been there, who's done that, who's available when I need them, rather than office hours. Somebody who's got kids would be great. We then having done our discovery work, tried to think about, okay, how could we enable a family helping family service? And that became Family by Family. It's been worked now with something like 1,500 families in New South Wales and South Australia over the last 6 or so years. And it finds and trains families who've been through tough times, and that's whole families, so inclusive of kids, to support families currently in tough times over a 10 to 30 week link up. So there's families, the sharing families that helps. 60% of those go on to education or employment, and 90% of the families meet their self-set goals through that program. A whole range of outcomes, from child protection outcomes, parenting outcomes, health and well-being outcomes, mental health outcomes. And so we were really, and as I said, we found Ange within a practitioner in New South Wales who was really great at supporting a number of restorations. The program wasn't designed for that. It's just that that's the kind of families that opted into the program. And so we were really interested in what Family by Family could add in the restoration space. And this is where we sort of started to think about this idea called joined up. It's way better than co-parenthood because it provides a bit more of a pathway for families. So it joined up a great service, My Kids and Me, with another restoration service and Family by Family to support sort of the before, during and after of restoration. And we're all set up to run that. And the day before the restoration service, evidence-informed restoration service, pulled out of that prototype. And the challenge was actually evidence. So they were worried that if this worked, they wouldn't be able to claim their attribution for it because it would have sort of affected their sample. And they were also concerned that if it didn't work, that it would sort of be some bad data inside their sample. And this is not to put it on that particular service, but the kind of contracts and funding conditions that they were in, they needed a very clean evaluation. So for the sake of evaluation, that experiment didn't happen, and families didn't get a service, and we haven't learned if that pathway, which is a hypothesis that could work, can actually lead to change. So I think this is that's a really interesting story about sort of evidence and some of the challenges it can put out there. At the same time, partway through this project, New South Wales moved to results-based payments around restoration, having realised that their previous method of payments were inadvertently incentivizing NGOs to keep children from restoration and in foster care. And so they put out a tender for people to put forward their restoration models, which was great for our project because we were working on a restoration model. But actually really hard, because in the ecosystem, there was no real easily accessible restoration program. There's no open source model that people could pick up. The rest of the providers, many of the providers we spoke to said, well, we don't really know how to do restoration. We haven't had much practice on that. The restoration literacy was low. Yet the government was sort of asking for that restoration model. And I think those two stories are quite interesting, and they talk to sometimes when we take a singular approach, we know that if we want to create change on some of these complex challenges, that we need multiple interventions, we need multiple supports, we need good pathways, we need to connect things together. But so often evidence is about individual interventions or individual programs, and we don't, even if you had a kind of 100% evidence-informed programs, how do you fit them together? And what's the evidence of how you fit together evidence-informed programs? So we've got to look to a different method of, we think we have to look to a different method of experimentation and think about not only how do you work and develop evidence-informed programs, but how do you create the conditions in a system to really work with evidence, to innovate, and to work with that complexity that all of our services and systems and research plays into. So we need to really think about that, that system element. So what needs to be part of a future social ecosystem? Well, these are sort of some views from us, but you will have others. And sort of a key part of it, of course, is knowing what works in this space, and that's a very crude way to put it. A lot of you guys spend making quite sophisticated questions around that stuff. But what works, I think, is only really going to be effective if it's actually tied together with some kind of coordinated innovation. We often see innovation in our sectors where it's competitive, with one provider trying to get a better develop a better program than another, and there's a role for competition. But also, we have the luxury of being able to work across states and across countries sometimes, and people are doing the same projects. And when we're able to do that, we try and help build on that. But actually, there could be some really interesting work we could be doing where experimentations in restoration in New South Wales could be picked up elsewhere, and great stuff is happening in Victoria elsewhere. And I know we haven't really been able to get that conversation going, but it seems like out of a smart system, a really interesting place to be playing. Commissioning is such a massive part of this, and this is sort of commissioning rather than contracting or procurement. How do you actually sort of create the environment for good new programs and services to exist in an ongoing way? How do you create funding flows for innovation and experimentation? But crucially, how do you actually fund intergenerational outcomes? This was another insight from our restoration work, is really if you want to create the knock-on effects for if you look at the rates of transmissions of abuse and neglect across generations, it's quite significant. Different studies will put it between sort of 30 to 90%. You guys may well have some better data than that on me, but it happens. So if you can make the difference in one family, or if you can make a difference in one family with 2 kids or 5 kids or 10 kids, the knock-on effects of that and the long-term savings are of course massive, and you guys all know this, but that's not how we think about funding services or how we think about outcomes. And often when people are in crisis, it's more about sort of helping them survive that crisis rather than seeing that as an opportunity to rebound people and to create those life-changing outcomes. So a couple of things that need to happen in the middle there that seem really important. Of course, stop things before they start. Predictive, preventative services. That's a mature discussion. Turning crisis points into turning points. That's what we try to do with co-parenthood. Those folks are not at the best of times, but actually they are engaging with systems. There is an opportunity. Many of those parents are looking to change, and with a little bit of extra and a different approach to support, it seems that you can move some people on at that stage, but we don't often see that as an opportunity. Peer-to-peer support seems to be massive here. So how do you get families to help families, or how do we activate lived experience? And in different ways, co-parenthood and family by family are examples of that, and there's many more out there. And we've seen the power of this in the caring space as well, caring for older people, and for folks with lived experience of caring, helping other folks with lived experience of caring, and navigate this really tough emotional and practical times. Working with whole families, so not just picking off the kid or mum or dad, but looking at whole families and working with the dynamic. And I think family by family is really demonstrating the power of that. And we actually train, as I said, whole families, which might be teenagers or young ones, to help old families. And there's sort of there's peer relationships and peer support going on there between teenager to teenager, or toddler to toddler, even teaching each other to walk. We've seen evidence of that happening. So it's a real interesting resource, but very few programs that sort of work on that, and really interested in exploring. So we'd be really interested in working with anybody who's exploring any of these ideas. A couple of things that feel important, but I haven't had a chance to talk about. Public accountability. How do we actually develop services that are accountable to the public? There's lots of decision making that happens in systems that's just public, and users of services aren't involved, and we've been trying to do that to some degree with our work with Family Safety Victoria around supporting safety hubs, and also a healthier public narrative around families experiencing disadvantage. How do we kind of shift perceptions around the experience of those families, what would help, and how this is actually good for everybody? The other thing this points to is how do a new set of capabilities for all of us, so whether you're working in policy or strategy, or whether you're working in commissioning, or whether you're working in frontline service delivery, how do we build our collective capabilities to work on creating intergenerational outcomes and working in systems complexity? Just a few things that we think might be good in a future system. So really happy to continue the conversation after this with anybody who's interested in any of that. And co-parent, as I said, we are looking for folks interested in running that, and family by family too in Victoria. So thank you very much.